Last week we looked at how British strategy developed in the interwar period for the Indian Ocean and how it fared in the opening years of World War II before the Japanese entry into said war. This week we're going to look at the rest of operations in the Indian Ocean during World War II in the form of a high-level overview. So with that said, let's get on with it. Now, while the airfields on Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, were being expanded and more aircraft, radar and anti-aircraft guns were being flown in, the Eastern Fleet itself in early 1942 was hiding out in the western part of the Indian Ocean. The plans were now to have 8 battleships of the 3 carriers in the area by summer, the 4 R-class, the 2 Nelsons, plus Warspite and Valiant, along with the carriers Illustrious, Formidable and Indomitable. Intelligence suggested that the Japanese Navy was deploying its forces for a more Pacific-facing set of priorities, which was accurate. The operations that would lead to the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway were beginning to enter their opening stages, and thus it was suggested that the Eastern Fleet might soon be able to go on the offensive against a much more limited Japanese defensive capability. In May 1942, the carrier Illustrious and the heavy cruiser Devonshire appeared, which meant that the Eastern Fleet now actually had 3 carriers, with more cruisers, and finally a few submarines also inbound. But first, that potential thorn in the Allied side that was Vichy-controlled Madagascar would need to be dealt with. The Illustrious and Devonshire were grouped with the carrier Indomitable, the battleship Ramillies, the cruisers Hermione, Dauntless, Gambier, Birmingham, and Jacob van Heemskerk, the last being Dutch, and 2 destroyer flotillas, plus various support craft, including the monitor HMS Erebus, all to transport 3 brigades plus a contingent of Royal Marines over to fight a Vichy force that consisted of around 8,000 men, although some of the more optimistic back in London thought that maybe this could all be done without fighting, with much of the rest of the Eastern Fleet in a more distant support role to be called in as needed. The Vichy defenders also had a small force made up of armed merchant cruisers, sloops and submarines, along with a few dozen aircraft. The campaign seemed to start off fairly well, with an armed merchant cruiser and a submarine sunk by a carrier airstrike in exchange for 1 Swordfish torpedo bomber being lost. The carriers then went to work reducing French air strength via attacks on the airfields directly, as well as by confronting them in the skies, where the Martlet, the F4F Wildcat in Fleet Air Arm colours, proved considerably superior to the MS-406 fighters and Potez 63 bombers on the Vichy side of things. They also managed to bag another French submarine, while the Vichy forces appealed to the Japanese for help, which was possibly understandable in the circumstances, but the intercepted transmission cemented in British minds the idea that Vichy France was really just a hostile Axis power, just one that simply lacked the effective capability to make war at the moment. Thanks to a British destroyer making a mad dash past coastal guns and landing some Royal Marines behind enemy lines, the main landings and the seizure of the Diego Suarez harbour was accomplished in just 3 days. However, capturing 1 port did not mean the entire island of Madagascar would be surrendered, and there would be another 6 months of low-level campaigning to carry out. Most of the fleet would therefore head off to other duties relatively soon after the first fireworks, but the battleship Ramillies was still around, providing fire support where needed at the end of May, when a number of large Japanese cruiser submarines showed up to see what was going on. The submarine I-10 used its recon aircraft to find the Royal Navy forces. In this case, Ramillies was in Diego Suarez harbour. And after this, I-16, I-18 and I-20 tried to launch midget submarines. I-18's launch didn't work properly, but those launched by I-16 and I-20 at least managed to head in roughly the right direction. One of them managed to score a torpedo hit on Ramillies, which knocked it out of action for a year, even while the midget sub was under attack from anti-submarine corvettes that had detected it. As the operation resulted in the loss of both midget submarines that had actually managed to launch properly, and British anti-submarine warfare efforts were audible even from the cruiser sub's deep water lurking points, the Japanese subs decided there was nothing much else they could do for the Vichy forces, and so went off to attack merchant shipping along the eastern African coast. This was actually fairly successful before the submarines were recalled to help in the Guadalcanal campaign, and when combined with other submarine activity later in the year, which we'll cover in a moment, would force a more extensive use of convoys and escorts in the area for some time to come. Once again, events were conspiring to bring down the Royal Navy's ambitions, though. With Ramillies out of action, although Valiant had arrived, the Indomitable was then called away to help Operation Pedestal in the Mediterranean. Rodney encountered steering issues and had to go back to the UK for more repairs, before being sent to join her sister ship Nelson, which had been diverted to the Mediterranean to also help out with Operation Pedestal, and by the time the dust had settled from that operation, it was time to ramp up Operation Torch, and thus much Allied attention remained in the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Fleet was once again denied the strength it needed to take the offensive. Similar demands redirected other planned reinforcements and then began to sap what strength the fleet still had left on station. The escalating situation in the Mediterranean and the destruction of much of the Japanese Navy's carrier force at Midway meant less need was seen to divert Japanese attention in the Pacific, and thus Formidable was soon on her way to the Mediterranean, since Indomitable had taken a beating during Pedestal. Although not before the imaginatively named Operation Stab took place, where most of what was left of the Eastern Fleet conducted a feint aimed at the Andaman Islands to try and divert Japanese forces from the upcoming American campaign on Guadalcanal. This operation went off without much in the way of casualties, but it only managed to divert a few Japanese units and ended early after the Dutch submarine O-23 reported sighting a couple of Japanese heavy cruisers plus destroyers headed for the Bay of Bengal, presumably on a raiding expedition. This offered tempting prey for the Eastern Fleet's primary striking force, but despite their best efforts, little further sign of the ships could be found, and so no interception was made. Just to make things even more interesting, the Germans decided to show up. Although Panzerschiff and Hilfskreuzer had been in the Indian Ocean sporadically during the opening years of the war, a reconcentration on the Atlantic had seen the area become mostly Kriegsmarine free until the arrival of Gruppe Eisbar in October 1942, operating primarily off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. Although this gateway to the Indian Ocean was technically the responsibility of the South Atlantic Station, the Eastern Fleet was rapidly becoming more of a slightly oddly placed reserve of ships for other operational areas, and destroyers and corvettes were soon on their way to help out. Unfortunately, this meant that the primary remaining strength of the Eastern Fleet could do very little other than swing anchor, as they now lacked an effective anti-submarine warfare screen. The Japanese attempted to replicate the success of the Hilfskreuzer with their own converted armed merchant cruisers, but after the Hokoku Maru, a medium-sized ocean liner converted at great expense, was lost in an apocalyptic fireball when operating alongside her sister Ikoku Maru in what should have been a completely one-sided fight with a small corvette and a tanker, such attempts were abandoned, which left Warspite patrolling the Indian Ocean trying to find Ikoku Maru with little success. Although the German U-179 would be caught and sunk by the destroyer HMS Active, the U-boats progressed up the East African coast steadily, although U-177 misidentified RMS Nova Scotia as an armed merchant cruiser, sank her, and then discovered that the ship actually had been carrying over 1,000 passengers, most of which were Italian prisoners of war, much like the recent Laconia incident. Since the fallout from the Laconia incident had resulted in the famous Laconia Order from Dönitz preventing him from assisting directly, the captain of U-179 radioed the issue home, and eventually the German government persuaded the Portuguese East African Authority, pretty much the only neutral power in the region with the ship, to help. They sent out a sloop, but by the time it got to the site of the sinking, only 192 people were still alive, a mixture of exposure and a large number of white-tipped sharks having accounted for 858 of those who'd survived the initial sinking. These, combined with earlier Japanese submarine operations, forced the convoy system to be put into operation, albeit as mentioned at the cost of the Eastern Fleet's offensive potential, as pretty much every destroyer, sloop and corvette was now assigned to convoy duty. As 1942 turned into 1943, more capital ships bled away. Valiant headed home in January, as did Illustrious, which left a grand total of Warspite holding the primary defence line, with Revenge, Resolution and Royal Sovereign as the only significant backup. U-boat Gruppe Seehund and the Italian submarine Leonardo da Vinci now showed up to make life more difficult. Although the convoy system managed to generally keep losses to a minimum, there were exceptions, such as in early March when U-160 managed to get past the screen of convoy DN-21 and sank 4 ships while damaging 2 others. One potential source of intelligence being passed to the enemy was stopped up by a rather unlikely combination of volunteers from the Calcutta Light Horse and Special Operations Executive Agents who planned to board and capture 4 Axis ships, 3 German and 1 Italian, who were stranded in Portuguese Goa on the coast of India. The largest and most modern of these, the Ironclad, was suspected of transmitting ships' sailing data to U-boats. The attack resulted in all 4 ships being scuttled, and with the related apprehension of a spy who'd been shuttling shipping information from Bombay to Goa, the transmissions seemed to stop. But in any event, with fuel running low, even with a supply sub out there to help them, the U-boats were recalled shortly thereafter, so what, if any effect, the whole thing had is questionable. Although the sinking of the Ehrenfels also prevented it from sailing to Japanese-held territory and being fitted out as a Hilfskreuzer, which had been a major Admiralty concern. But summer 1943 brought more unwelcome news. Half a dozen German, 3 Italian, and a number of Japanese submarines were now all based at Penang, on the west coast of Malaya, somewhat northwest of Singapore, and right on the edge of the Bay of Bengal. The first group of submarines in this list would become Gruppe Monsoon, or the Monsoon Group, named as they had arrived at the end of the monsoon season, although only 5 out of the 11 U-boats originally sent out had actually made it. The rest had mostly been sunk by Allied anti-submarine warfare vessels along the way. Of course, all of this activity roughly coincided with the Italian armistice, which saw the 3 Italian submarines almost immediately taken over by the Japanese Navy, although they didn't put them to much use, and with the Mediterranean therefore now clear of potential Regia Marina interference, quite a number of ships could now sail through the Straits of Gibraltar and along to the Suez Canal, shortening the supply routes considerably, albeit there was still a risk of the Luftwaffe and the occasional U-boat attack in the Mediterranean. But with significantly less pressure on the routes going around South Africa, it looked like the Eastern Fleet might be able to start boosting its numbers again. Only, in a pattern you no doubt have seen coming by this point, these hopes would be dashed, at first by the recall of the remaining R-class, which were by this point on their last legs, as well as Warspite, which had been recalled back in May to help with the invasion of Italy. This meant that when Ramillies emerged from her long period in dry dock, she found herself the only Allied capital ship in the Indian Ocean. The presence of the Monsoon Group put a hold on ambitious plans from home for a 30,000 to 40,000 strong amphibious landing behind Japanese lines in Burma, while Somerville redeployed resources from South Africa to the northern part of the Indian Ocean so that new convoys could be organised to counter the U-boat threat, which fortunately was being fairly closely monitored by Bletchley Park's cryptography section. There was another small bright spot. It turned out that the humidity and heat of the Bay of Bengal was well beyond what the U-boats had been designed to tolerate, and their batteries, plus those of their electric torpedoes, degraded rapidly, forcing the submarines to make trips to Japan to find replacements. The situation became bad enough that the Germans managed to persuade the Japanese to hand over the 3 Italian subs, which were marginally better suited to hot and humid conditions, although the Germans then used these as transport and supply craft instead of in an offensive role. 7 Japanese submarines were working alongside them, and they managed to cause more damage than the Germans, mostly on account of being perfectly accustomed to the climate conditions, and some of the convoy routes being discontinued at the end of the year, around when the Japanese really stepped up their submarine efforts, as the area was running critically short of escorts, which caused significant delays in the transports of goods and other materials, which was playing into the then ongoing Bengal famine, resulting in a catch-22 of either sending in relief ships quickly enough as soon as they were loaded through the Bay of Bengal on their own, which risked them being sunk outright with ease by the various Axis raiders, or waiting to assemble them in convoys, which stood a better chance of them getting through, but was of course of little comfort to those starving while they were waiting for the ship's escorts to arrive. And on top of that, of course, every single ship that was sunk, with whatever cargo aboard, meant that there were increasing demands on the remaining ships for all kinds of cargo movement. But as 1943 turned into 1944, things began to finally look up for the Eastern Fleet. It started with the dispatch of the battlecruiser Renown, the carrier Illustrious, and the battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, along with the honestly not a carrier governor, HMS Unicorn. These were limited in their expeditionary capabilities by the need to divert the escorts they came with to deal with the still ongoing submarine situation. But the ongoing issues with the climate and operating out of the relatively austere Penang base meant that a number of U-boats were instead loaded up with strategically important cargo and recalled home. These operations were complicated by the British risking the exposure of their ultra-intelligence capabilities by providing the exact sailing routes and times of the two support ships for that operation to Somerville, who sent the destroyer Relentless to dispatch both of those supply vessels. This in turn meant that only the U-188 made it all the way home to German-occupied Europe, and the other submarines en route had to make their way back to Penang, depriving Germany of vital resources and keeping many of the Monsoon Group's U-boats at sea and wearing themselves out from well away from merchant shipping for quite some months. Between this and a couple of the Japanese Navy subs being sunk, although those large vessels were noted as quite tough customers needing a number of depth charges to put down, the submarine threat gradually began to recede. Only, of course, for the Japanese Navy's surface threat to suddenly spike, as over in the Pacific, Admiral Spruance was merrily overseeing his fleet's raising, or I think more accurately that should be described as lowering, the Japanese base at Truk to the ground, which had forced a good chunk of the combined fleet to relocate rather rapidly for safety. Suddenly, multiple Japanese capital ships and a vast collection of cruisers and destroyers had shown up in the vicinity of Singapore, and although Somerville appreciated the main reason for the move was to hide the Japanese fleet from the American fleet, he couldn't entirely discount someone in the Japanese Navy taking a chance to lash out at the Eastern Fleet by way of revenge. And indeed, 3 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Alba, Chikuma and Tone, would make an abortive raiding attempt into the Indian Ocean, albeit they only managed to sink a single merchant ship between them before heading for home. While everybody was waiting to see what else might happen, welcome reinforcements continued to arrive, although neither would fly the white ensign. Under the Stars and Stripes came the carrier USS Saratoga and some escorting destroyers, while under the Cross of Lorraine came the Free French battleship Richelieu. There was also an Italian proposal, although this was ultimately declined, to send the Italia, the formerly Littorio, and the Vittorio Veneto to help out as well, which caused Somerville to quip that he'd have to replace the main fleet command and communication radio station with the Tower of Babel at the rate that this was going. Saratoga's pilots were welcomed aboard the Illustrious to help the two air groups get to know each other, which was very well facilitated by the consumption in a single evening of over 700 bottles of beer and around 70 bottles of whiskey and gin. After the hangovers had been dealt with and Illustrious had been restocked, joint training commenced. Saratoga had of course done this once before with HMS Victorious over in the Pacific. This time, the Americans were here to teach the British how to speed up their air group's launch time, while the British tried to show them the performance differences between the Barracuda and the Avenger. This early model of Barracuda did not come off well in that particular comparison. The Eastern Fleet then put these newly learned skills into practice in April 1944 with a joint carrier strike against Japanese airfields, oil storage facilities, and shipping at Sabang, which went pretty well. Both carriers' air groups arrived at pretty much the same time, total surprise was achieved, and the only Allied aircraft lost was a Hellcat, whose pilot was picked up by the submarine HMS Tactician, which had been put in place specifically for that job. Although it was decided that for the moment the Barracudas would be landed and replaced with Avengers until either tuning up by technicians ashore or more powerfully engined models could remedy their deficiencies. although in the event they would eventually be reintroduced to Eastern Fleet service when it turned out that the Barracuda couldn't quite take off of an escort carrier in Indian Ocean climate conditions, whereas an Avenger could. And that made the Avenger the choice for anti-submarine warfare operations conducted off the escort carriers, which meant that Barracudas had to go back on the fleet carriers, but that was for a few months down the line. Going back to April and May, there was a follow-up strike on Surabaya, which was the Japanese anti-submarine warfare base for the Java Sea, and whose existence the US subs operating in the area were finding increasingly annoying. For the loss in combat of one Avenger, plus a couple of other aircraft that had to ditch early with engine problems, a major oil refinery and a considerable amount of shipping and dockyard infrastructure was destroyed, significantly hampering Japanese efforts in the area. The refinery in particular was the only one on Java capable of making aviation-grade fuel out of the local oil stocks, and its loss would greatly hamper Japanese air patrols, much to the US submarine crew's delight. Saratoga was now recalled back to the US fleet proper, and this temporarily dropped the Eastern Fleet back to one carrier in late May 1944, as Victorious and Formidable were not due to arrive for another 6 weeks. Instead, some of the escort carriers were pressed into frontline duties, and the fleet tried to distract the Japanese from the upcoming Mariana Islands campaign. When the Japanese didn't react to a simulated invasion force, the Eastern Fleet would instead launch an attack on the Andaman Island port facilities and airfields. Illustrious managed to loft 51 aircraft all on her own, with a few still in reserve. This took up most of the time before reinforcements arrived, which was just as well as it was discovered that operating escort carriers directly with fleet carriers was quite difficult due to the rather considerable difference in speed. Although it turned out Formidable had been retained for service back in European waters and thus swapped out for Indomitable. But since Indomitable was just back from repairs in the US, she was left at Ceylon to work up, while Illustrious and Victorious headed out. This time they were in a backseat role, providing air cover as Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, Renown and Richelieu conducted a shore bombardment of Sabang. The only opposition they encountered here were some notably green pilots flying Zeros, which is perhaps understandable as this operation took place just weeks after the bulk of the Japanese Navy's land and sea-based strike and fighter aircraft had been thrown at Task Force 58 in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and had subsequently been introduced to just how many 50 caliber, 20mm and 40mm rounds the US Navy was now carrying around with it. Summer would see the fortunes of the Eastern Fleet continue to rise. Indomitable was soon ready for action, and the battleship Howe arrived just in time to replace Valiant, which was damaged when a floating dry dock it was in at the time collapsed. This enlarged force then struck a series of targets in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, culminating in a strike on Sabang. However, the days of the Eastern Fleet were now numbered. In August, Somerville was relieved by Admiral Fraser. Behind-the-scenes negotiations were going on between the US and British political leadership on what the shape of future naval operations was going to look like, and soon the Eastern Fleet was no more. In its place stood the rapidly expanding British Pacific Fleet, and very soon this fleet would sail east, and the Indian Ocean would be, mostly, a calm transit area once more.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.